in our beginnings, we were, after all, in the midst of the 60s ferment. And one of the things that was in that ferment was that every institution was being looked at to see whether it was successful in what it said it was out to do.
The East started fertilizing the West more. It always is in phases, but it became prominent, especially with the Beatles. You know, right? We all got very fascinated by what the East had to teach the West.
A lot of the people who were influenced by Asian religions and who had taken mind-altering substances tried to explain it in terms of Western psychology, and I think they came up largely against a brick wall.
People were discovering that their religious traditions, in many cases, had dried up. That they were not getting the experience of being closer to their divine inner nature by going through the church, mosque, synagogue that they'd been brought up in.
The whole human potential movement was very much a factor here, so that people were beginning to get interested in growth experiences. They recognized that group experiences, for example, going to workshops, going to conferences, just opened up new worlds that they hadn't explored before. So there was a sense of a richness of human experience that had not yet been studied, had not yet been understood in an adequate way.
In the West Coast and the East Coast we had be-ins, and there was a youth interest in new religious ideas. Spirituality was emerging as a kind of primary generational interest, and older adults were waking up to these issues too. I think
people began to see that the evolution of consciousness was not something that stops when you reach adulthood. In fact, that may be just the beginning, and that we continue to grow throughout life, and that there are tremendously many more potentials than we're usually aware of that we can unfold, and it can lead to more peace, love, and joy.
What transpersonal psychology adds is what's traditionally been called spirit. This is the inner side, the intuitive side, the part that longs for meaning and value, the part that was deliberately, consciously left out by mainstream psychology.
The main event going on was a sense that where American psychology wasn't where the cutting edge or the innovations were going to come. And the people who were most interested in these changes basically were connected with Abraham Maslow, the psychologist who developed self-actualization theory.
Transpersonal psychology is a relatively new field of psychology. It's been around since about 1969 when it was founded as an association of transpersonal psychology. Basically is more holistic than mainstream psychology and more spiritual.
I was attracted to transpersonal psychology because it really addressed the whole person, and it was the only branch of psychology that took an interest in the spiritual dimensions. In those days, 30 years ago, you couldn't even mention the word spirituality around psychologists because they were all trying so hard to be scientific.
Jung was actually the first transpersonal psychologist. He broke with Freud over the issue of excluding the spirit from psychology. And so it puts back in what had always been there in pre-modern times, which is basically the idea that human nature consists of body, mind, and spirit. The project of modern psychology was to try to have a psychology with spirit left out.
If you think of a normal bell curve of anything, normal psychology or conventional psychology tends to look at from the middle on down into the psychopathology and weirdness and mental illness part. Now, the other half of the normal bell curve, from normal to superior to exceptional to dazzling to the people who change whole cultures, which turn out to be a combination of heroes, saints, visionaries. I'm just as interested in that.
You can say that transpersonal psychology is a system of thinking that covers the whole spectrum of human experience, which includes what we call non-ordinary states of consciousness. Now, what's I think very specific for transpersonal psychology is that it not only studies these states, but that transpersonal psychologists hold these states in great esteem. Transpersonal psychology has shown that these states are, if they're properly understood, properly supported, that they are actually healing, that they are transformative and even in a sense evolutionary.
What it was about in the beginning was publications, because there were a lot of ideas around in the early 60s about psychology, and the culture was changing, and it was the beginning of, quote, the 60s as we know it.
Around that same time, people started working with consciousness expanding drugs, so called consciousness expanding drugs, that basically, now some people use them as adjuncts to psychotherapy dealing with neurotic problems. But other people felt there's other uses that seem to go into dimensions of what ordinarily in the past would have been considered the psychology of religion. You know, William James, 1901, he wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. Religious experience. So Maslow and Grof and others felt they needed a new approach was needed to deal with areas beyond the normal, that are not pathological, but touch into areas of religion, mysticism, higher states of consciousness, the kinds of things that Eastern philosophy deals with a lot.
Transpersonal psychology actually arose out of the living room of Anthony Sudich, who lived in Palo Alto, California. And Anthony Sudich, a very unsung hero, actually founded 2 out of the 4 major forms of psychology in the world.
Transpersonal psychology attracted people who were also aware that there was something beyond what usual psychology studied. We didn't really know what we were doing at the beginning, so it's almost, I suppose you could say, some kind of almost miraculous that people will gather around something which is so open-ended, so undefined at the moment.
The idea that there could be an interest in consciousness, research, spiritual, developmental psychology, that there could be a psychology that involves the whole span of human experience and human life, and that this did not exclude things because methodologically they were hard to deal with. The idea that that could be handled through a scientific, scholarly, clinically professional approach was fairly new.
A lot of it had to do with Abe's friends, Tony's friends, a lot of the people. Jim Fadiman brought a lot of people in. Stan Grof came in because he had had experiences he was trying to deal with in some way.
He was actually recovering after a heart attack at that time. And this was very interesting. I arrived at the Maslow residence and rang the bell, and his wife Bertha came to answer the door, and I had this very distinct feeling of really being unwelcome. She was almost blocking the entry into the house with her body, but then finally, you know, stepped back, and Abe and I connected and had a wonderful time, and also Bertha and I made good connection, and we had all dinner. And then she told me what was behind this. She said that when he read the manuscript describing my work, that he was so excited about the parallels that she was worried that if the two of us get together and start talking, that it's going to be too much excitement for him, that he could have another heart attack.
When the first issue of the Journal of Transpersonal was published, it was published the same month that the lunar landing occurred, where we walked on the moon for the first time. And I remember sitting with Tony Sudich in his living room. We were watching TV with other people in the room, and here comes the message back with the video coming back from the surface of the moon. Somebody has stepped on, is walking on the moon. And I said to Tony, I think we both thought of it at the same time, well, it's opening up this frontier just like what we're doing with this journal. We're opening up all the way into space. Now we know we can leave the planet and land somewhere else and explore. That's what we're trying to do in psychology. We're trying to open up that big edge that is so hard to get a hold of. And we're going to do it as much as possible, staying within a scientific, scholarly, professional role.
I became part of this. I was invited into this small group that was formulating these principles of the new psychology of the force. Now Abe and Tony wanted to call this psychology transhumanistic, going even beyond humanistic psychology. And then they looked at what I have written about the experiences in psychedelic sessions, where I talk about 3 levels of experience: biographical, perinatal, focusing on reliving of birth and prenatal life. And then I described a large group of experiences, or even a level in the unconscious that I called transpersonal. And so they got very excited about this term transpersonal and moved from transhumanistic to transpersonal.
When I look at the whole history of it, I think of it in terms of a job application, which is, if you want to start 2 new psychologies in America that will also be effective overseas and have thousands of people involved in 2 organizations at least, putting on conferences for hundreds and hundreds of professionals attend, and it's going to generate shelves and shelves of professional and scholarly literature, and it's going to go on for 20, 30, 40 or more years, you only have one applicant to do this job. And this applicant completed 9th grade only. He has a house in Palo Alto, and he makes his living and supports himself as a psychologist, a counselor, but he never got a degree. And in addition to not having anything beyond a 9th grade education, he can't get up and walk. He can't take a book off the shelf because he is lying on his back and has been on his back for decades because he was disabled by a severe case of juvenile arthritis before any effective medications were available. Well, you have to fill in the spots on the application that ordinarily wouldn't be there. Number 1 is he read everything he could get his hands on, remembered most of it, and was constantly integrating it. The second thing that's interesting about this guy is he had a terrific mind. He not only read, but he knew what to do with it all. And I'm going to tell a story out of class here. He was a labor agitator in the Depression. He was the guy who made the plans and sent them out to other people. Now, in the Depression, there was a lot of labor difficulty and violence, and a lot of people were in deep trouble because of the Depression. But nobody thought that a guy lying on his back who was totally disabled in a little house in Palo Alto could possibly have anything to do with this.
He couldn't move his legs, couldn't blow his own nose, couldn't feed himself, and was on this gurney, and I used to turn the pages of the papers that we would get in. And Tony told me, Sonia, in the condition I'm in, the only kind of play I can do is intellectual play. And that's what we did every afternoon for 3 or 4 hours for probably 4 years. And in the beginning, Abe joined us. So we were there when we were doing all this thing about what kind of statements we would make about transpersonal psychology. And it was Tony and Abe who actually sent me over to the Zendo. which was nearby my home, only a 10-minute drive from my home, because they were interested in what Asian psychologists had to say about the farther reaches of human development.
Transpersonal really began as much in the living room of Tony Sudich as any place on earth. And each week we would have like a salon, and somebody amazing would come through, lured by this, who was this amazing man in the slant bed, and we would hang out with them, and they would, in a sense, really teach us. These were gurus that passed through and major researchers and so forth. And gradually the journal began to emerge, and out of the journal we realized that you don't run a journal when you're really a poor little group. You have an association, and the purpose of the association is to charge a number of people more than you could charge them for the journal.
Culturally, the transpersonal movement can really be traced in the West all the way back to the Eleusinian mysteries. Transpersonal psychology is really in its contemporary form, a reaction to the reliance on the mundane, everyday state of consciousness, which we need to function in our everyday lives. We need it when we're driving through traffic. We need it when we're paying our bills and just kind of making ordinary plans and so on. But it's not the best state of consciousness for deepening our connection to a sense of some larger meaning in the universe, a sense of connection to a higher power, other things that are very important historically to human existence. So the Eleusinian mysteries were a ritual that was part of the life in Greece for around 500 years, and people were limited to participating in this a single time in their entire life. It was a 4-day ritual. The best historical evidence is that it included ingesting an LSD-like substance, and people were forbidden to talk about what they had experienced during this ritual under the penalty of death. So historians like Eugene Taylor really trace the cultural origins of transpersonal psychology back to this movement, and then throughout history to movements, for example, in the United States that included people meditating in caves in Pennsylvania during the 1700s. America became truly a spiritual democracy where splinter groups from all over Europe could come and live in their kind of spiritual communes and live lives that they could not live in Europe, where the dominant powers, whether it was the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church, insisted that people worship in the way that the church mandated. So America has always been a kind of experiment in spiritual democracy. Now, in the 1800s, the Transcendentalists began to incorporate many of the practices that were just becoming known in the West. Practices from India and Tibet and so on. Those practices were really only known to a very small group of people in the West. There certainly were publications on them, and the kind of literati knew about them, and there were small groups who practiced them. It was really in the 1960s, through books like Alan Watts' book on Zen and Enlightenment, through the Maharishi, packaging meditation in a form where people could readily learn the practice, also through the widespread use of psychedelic drugs, where people would spontaneously have these kinds of experiences. So that's what really created the kind of cultural opening to these transpersonal experiences. Again, I want to distinguish between transpersonal experiences and transpersonal psychology. because it was really transpersonal psychology that then came in and said, these are really important experiences for us as psychologists to study and to understand.
I was working at the Department of Psychiatry of the School of Medicine in Prague, and we just were finishing a large study of malarial, one of the early tranquilizers. And one day, the department when I was working got a large box of ampules from Sandoz, and a letter came with it. And the letter said this was a very exciting investigational new substance that was discovered, or the effects of which were discovered practically by accident by Dr. Hoffman, the leading chemist in the laboratories. It's called LSD-25. So I wouldn't have missed this for anything in the world. I kind of, became one of the early volunteers. And I had an experience that just really changed my life, both professionally and personally. The man who was my preceptor, who got the supply, was very interested in electroencephalography. So everybody who wanted a session had to have EEG before, during, and after. Now, what this meant practically is that between the second and the third hour, when the session culminates, my experience culminated, this research assistant came and said this was time for driving the brainwaves. So she took me to this little cell. I lay down, she pasted the electrodes on my head and asked me to close my eyes, then brought this gigantic stroboscopic light, put it above my head, and then turned this thing on. And in the next moment, there was light like I had never seen in my life, couldn't even imagine existed. I read later sort of some of the descriptions of the mystics. They talk about, millions of suns and so on. That was what happened to me. And the only context I had for understanding or relating to it was I thought, this is what it must have been like in Hiroshima when the bomb went off. Today I think it was more like the Dharmakaya, like the primary clear light from the Tibetan Book of the Dead that supposedly appears at the time when we die. Now what happened experientially is that my consciousness was catapulted out of my body, separated from my body. I lost the research assistant, I lost the clinic, I lost Prague, I lost the planet, and suddenly I was in a state where my consciousness had no boundaries. I had the feeling I became the universe. And there were a lot of processes happening for which at the time I had no names, but later I was vaguely able to relate to concepts like Big Bang, black holes, white holes. When I was reading that seemed to be like related to what happened in that session. And it was just absolutely clear to me that the consciousness is not a product of the brain, that those are two separate entities. It's like a driver and the car. So I was very impressed. And I felt, since I'm stuck in psychiatry, by far the most interesting thing I can do in my life or with my life is to study these states. So it's going to be soon half a century when I had this experience, and since that time I have really done very little professionally that would not be related in one way or another to these non-ordinary states.
I use this model of the altered state, the set and setting. You have to look at the set and setting to find out what the content of the experience is. That's true of dreams too. It's true right now in a waking state. We have a certain intention, we have a certain setting. What else is there? It's the inner and the outer, right? And similarly with substances like LSD, you had an external catalyst that pretty reliably, given the appropriate set and setting, could induce mystical or religious experiences that were otherwise completely unusual. In fact, there was a study done at Harvard by a person called Walter Pankey, who was an MD and getting his PhD in the history of religion. And he took the idea of set and setting seriously and said, let's pick out a group of people who are interested in religious experience, like theology students at a seminary. And let's pick a setting, where in a chapel, during a service, a Good Friday service, in a chapel separate from the main chapel. and let's tell them we're interested in inducing, a religious experience, and we did a double-blind placebo-controlled study like you do with strict psychopharmacology, where half the group got placebo and half the group got psilocybin, and then he had a list of criteria from the mysticism literature, and on all of the criteria, the group that got psilocybin reported significantly higher incidences, including like certain knowledge and ineffability, paradoxicality, transcendence of time and space. Only one criteria there was no difference, and that was like a general feeling of love. Whether people going to church Good Friday, they had a general feeling of love also, whether they took something or not. So, and that changed later on, follow-up studies 6 months later, and somebody did a follow-up study 25 years later with some of these people. And they remembered the experience, and they still interpret it the same way.
The International Foundation for Advanced Study had what was called an investigational drug license. And we had told the federal government that we were working with people in a therapeutic environment. And they came and checked us out now and then, and the Food and Drug Administration cops came and checked our material. We used to, in a sense, put aside Wednesdays for someone to come and surprise us with a visit for some government agency. So we were highly observed.
And this was at Stanford?
This was not at Stanford. Stanford wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Stanford was terrified of becoming the Harvard of the West, and I was the most likely person to do it to them. We were working on working with materials at a very low dose of psychedelics for intellectual problems with senior scientists, and the way in which that day would run with them, the experimental day, was they would come in and they would get stereo headphones, and they would be lying on a couch with a black eye shade and listening to classical music. And then around noon we would take off the eye shades and offer them a little bit of food, mostly turned down, and say basically get to work. And out of that came a number of patents, a number of breakthrough kind of inventions, very good stuff. And while we were doing that, in the midst of about halfway through the number of people we felt we were going to run as a research project, we got a letter from the federal government. And it said, if you have opened this letter, we have just closed down your research project. Meaning your investigational drug license to do research in this area has been terminated as of the receipt of this letter. And I recall, because we were sitting in a little room next to our session room, we had 4 people lying there, major scientists, most of them now referred by other people who had been our scientists, listening to the later Beethoven quartets. And I looked around as the youngest member of this group and said, I think we got this letter tomorrow. And we all acknowledged that that probably was a good idea.
It was too much for some people, okay? Some people had difficulty handling the experiences, or they used them the wrong way, or they got distracted by the pleasure of it instead of learning from it. But other people saw we could all be mystics of a sort. We could all have a direct feeling for the transpersonal, the spiritual, and begin to base our lives on that. And that revolutionized our whole culture, and in ways we're still just beginning to find out. Let me give you a personal example. When I was in graduate school, one of the psychiatrists in the psychology department where I was training was doing LSD research. And I was a subject for him a number of times in between taking exams and going to classes and all that. I had marvelous insights into the nature of the human mind that way. Things which were abstract ideas like dissociation. You know, intellectually I knew all about dissociation, but it wasn't until I'd had a psychedelic experience that involved a lot of dissociation that I suddenly at a deep level understood, oh, that's what that stuff is, and that's how it works. It gave me a lot of understandings of the way the human mind works, which have gradually come out in a more formal kind of way in my own research over the years. So for most of my work in altered states of consciousness, for instance, I've tried to experience at least something
of particular states, so I have an inside idea of what it's about. If you don't have an inside idea, you can do awfully silly things. If you took a behaviorist approach to psychedelic drugs like LSD, for instance, you would probably say that most of the time they act like a sedative or a tranquilizer because people sit still and don't do anything for a long time. And that's not what's happening.
And William James, and he studied parapsychological experiments, somnambulism, hypnotism, all kinds of unusual experiments. He studied psychedelic experience. He took nitrous oxide. And he said, he had an amazing quotation. He said, all around our ordinary consciousness, separated by the filmiest of screens, lie other realms of reality. And no account of human consciousness that leaves these other realms out of account can be considered complete.
And we ourselves had a large study using LSD therapy with terminal cancer patients, seeing if we can influence somehow the attitude towards death and transform the process of dying through mystical experiences. This was probably the most interesting, the most moving work that I have ever been involved in. Results would be that a significant number of the patients were rated as significantly improved in a variety of areas, subjective experiences, all the way to how easy it was to manage them and so on, the influence on pain. There was about 1/3 of the patients who were seen as essentially, I would say about 1/3 dramatically improved, 1/3 sort of moderate improvements, and then there was 1/3 when there were no major changes that we could detect. It was in 3 areas. Generally, we saw great changes emotionally, in terms of depression, tension, insomnia, things of that kind. We saw also very specific changes in the attitude towards death. They developed a very convincing feeling that if they die, it's the body that dies, that it's not they who die. So it seemed to have transformed also the experience of dying itself in those patients whom we could follow in the process of death. And then the third area was we found out that LSD had very powerful influence in many patients on pain. Sometimes even pain that was not tractable by narcotics. Of course, the propaganda came, when the image of LSD suddenly was dictated by journalists, and the criterion was what happened to people when they take it in the street rather than what you do when you run a responsible therapeutic experiment and so on. That was one part of it. The other part was that in these situations, the administrators and the legislators didn't want to take the responsibility. They were afraid of malpractice suits, which are very, very common in this country. And we got a very strange answer when we asked for more money for the research. They said, "You have already proved that it's useful. There's no reason to research it any further." That was their response.
So we were taking the risks. For instance, when I graduated from Stanford, vanilla A educational institution, but my dissertation was on the effective use of psychedelics in psychotherapy, it was clear that I was not only an incredibly innovative researcher on a cutting-edge field, but nobody wanted to give me a job.
I think the kind of person who feels that, well, this world of getting up in the morning and getting into the freeways and to work and hurrying and trying to accomplish and getting only half of it done every day, and then coming home at night and going to bed and getting up the next morning and doing the same routine, that's not quite enough. That there's got to be more to the meaning of our lives.
The people that are drawn into the field, and both faculty and students and staff, people who work as secretaries and clerks and registrars are often themselves on a spiritual path. They're asking good questions about their lives and often care deeply about how things work in the world and how to be kinder.
I think in a very basic way, people drawn to transpersonal psychology are very likely to be people who, even from childhood, did not think that things are simply the way they appear. People that have seen beyond ordinary appearance into the complexity of human experience. For whatever reason, there's a lot of different reasons that a person's perspective on life can shift. It could be simply through your upbringing. It could be through an illness. It could be through a traumatic event. It could be by virtue of being gifted in some way that sets you apart, but some way of seeing that things are beyond their mere appearance. I'm speaking trying to be in the simplest sense of what's this impetus in people to go beyond the ordinary, go beyond go beyond consensus reality.
The fact that we have all these different religious traditions in the world and we're all bumping up against each other raises questions. It's like, what if I'd been born over there? You know, when I'm born here, this is the truth, you know. Well, what if I was born over there? Would that be the truth? And, you know, one response to that is to throw it out and say, well, it's all baloney. Another response is to go really into your tradition and say, we're right and you guys are all wrong. But for the people that can't do either one of those, who go, you know what, I've had experiences where there's really something going on. There's something bigger than me. I know that. But it doesn't make sense to me to put it in a little box and say, I'm right and all you guys are wrong. I think that's the kind of person that goes to transpersonal psychology and says, I want to understand this. I need to have a bigger picture. I need to reinvent. I need to be part of the process of reinventing the understanding of who we are and how we relate to this something that's bigger than we are.
I think I'm one of those many people that primarily was drawn to it as a kind of lifeboat in academia, because I was in graduate school interested in shamanism, in my case, and there was simply no way to fit it into my program. And the area that most allowed me to be able to talk about shamanism with my professors was transpersonal psychology.
Psychology of Buddhism and the meditation practices, for example, Siddha Yoga or Sufi practices, Buddhist meditation in all its forms, whether it's Zen or Vipassana or Tibetan Buddhism, were all becoming increasingly popular. And it was only transpersonal psychology that really made any effort to understand what was happening when people did take their meditation practice seriously.
When I brought out my Altered States of Consciousness book back in 1969, I had a section on meditation, and I bragged in the introduction to that section that I was reprinting 2/3 of the English language scientific literature on meditation, which sounded very impressive till you realize it was 2 of the 3 articles that existed. There was almost no scientific research on meditation. Then, years later in the 70s, there was an article published in Science that found some physiological correlates of transcendental meditation. And all of a sudden, that legitimatized it for mainstream science. If it affected the brain and the body, maybe meditation is real instead of some weird thing that comes from the East. So it legitimatized research, and now there's more than probably 1,400, 1,500 scientific studies on meditation published.
Meditative practice is a practice that, generally speaking, attempts to either pacify or modulate the mental processes so that they become more permeable to the light of consciousness, to the energy of consciousness. They become more porous to it, so that the mind relaxes, and then when the mind relaxes, naturally becomes more permeable or porous to that kind of like greater knowledge, greater consciousness, and then there is more chances of a descent or an ascent. No?
I think one of the best things for therapists in training is to learn to meditate, because it does quiet the mind and give one a capacity for listening more deeply to oneself and others. And I think that when somebody is in therapy and they also have a meditation practice, it's as though the process goes along much faster, because when you sit down to meditate, all sorts of things come up, and then it's all grist for the mill for the psychotherapy process. I find that people who are meditators tend to make much more rapid progress in therapy, and I think that it's just a real asset. However, I don't think one is a substitute for the other. I do think that one of the splits that exists in our culture that hopefully will be healed is that often meditation teachers do not think that therapy is valuable, and sometimes there are some therapists that don't think meditation is valuable.
One of transpersonal psychology's big jobs that it's going to take many years to do is to classify the different kinds of meditation practices and to find out what kind works for what kind of person. So that eventually someday we might be able to say, for your personality type, don't do Zen meditation because too many people go off the deep end with it and not enough people feel they've spiritually grown. But this other kind of meditation is good for your personality type. We don't know anywhere near enough to be able to make those kind of recommendations at this point. But that's my hope for the future of our field.
I think it's hard to describe. I think it's hard to describe in the same way that, how would you describe the experience of waking up in the morning? It's as though when you're in a dream, you think that's reality. It's the way it is. Then all of a sudden, you wake up and you discover that it was only a dream.
But you see, when you wake up from sleep, you awaken to what you then take to be real. And I kind of like to think of the spiritual awakening as simply awakening, rather than moving from one kind of spellboundness to another. You just awaken.
And I think that's what happens in our lives, that we at some point begin to recognize that all of the past and all of the future exist only in the mind, and that our reality is in this present moment, and that a spiritual awakening allows us to see how much of our lives is spent in dreaming. Most of our time is spent thinking about the past or the future, and that takes away from our capacity to live fully in the present.
In simple terms, I would describe it probably in two directions. One direction would be like a process of gradual letting go of our narcissism and self-centeredness at all levels, not only conscious but also physical and emotional and sexual, and in all its forms, the more gross, the more obvious, and the more subtle. And that I would say is pretty never-ending. And then the other direction would be like as a process of becoming more complete human beings. And by a complete human being, I mean something very simple. I mean like a human being that is fully grounded in this reality, fully here on planet Earth, without needing to go anywhere else, to be full and complete and free, but at the same time open to all those energies of consciousness here and open to all those energies of life from this plane. No?
Inevitably, when a person has a spiritual awakening, it's intensely personal, but also inevitably, if one is going to evolve in it and find ways to live here, one begins to see that others have had this experience and that traditions have evolved around people having the same basic experience. And then you have to ask yourself, what do I fit in best with, or do I fit in any of them, and what do I want to incorporate for myself as a way to live in this world? Because it is going to have to end up in relationship. You know, we have spiritual awakenings, but we don't have them in isolation. We affect others by our spiritual awakening, and they affect us as well.
The Tibetan Buddhists like to talk about hedwa, some terrible shock. You stand there in front of the Twin Towers, and suddenly you might feel a lot lighter. I mean, it's horrible. But there's an opening, and a new mind state can come in. I do think awakening is about your mind state, and it's about presence, immediacy, all at once. You know, how do you take in the all, stop guarding against the all, have a kind of all at onceness? All right, that's the awakening. And then can you stabilize it? Or do you lose it and forget it?
Spiritual awakening for me is experienced most deeply in my physical body. And in that sense, I'm probably different than a lot of people. But perhaps more like a lot of lay people who wouldn't call themselves transpersonal psychologists. I think a lot of people, for instance, who love fly fishing or sports, go in the zone, as it's often called, and those experiences are basically spiritual in my understanding, and allow for a kind of at oneness with one's environment and one's activity, which is very physical as well as spiritual. And from my perspective, I can actually feel those changes in my body. My body becomes more light-filled, literally, or more porous. Spiritual development in many ways is about creating spaciousness. It's about creating space, and even the field might be described as a field which creates space. It creates spaciousness, capacity, rather than to think about it as a field with a fixed definition.
Well, I think the main asset that a transpersonal psychologist brings to the practice of psychotherapy is an openness to the many dimensions of experience that transcend ordinary rationality. So that while cognitive psychology works with beliefs, it's very much grounded in the rational. And there are certain experiences which are not rational and yet are very significant for people. And I think it's important to recognize that non-rational experiences aren't necessarily pre-rational, that some of them are trans-rational. But it doesn't mean that all non-rational experiences are trans-rational. Some of them are pre-rational. Some of them really are regressive, and that may or may not be regression in service of the ego, but that a person needs to be able to manage their experiences in such a way that it doesn't totally destroy or disrupt their lives. And that, so there needs to be some grounding. It's not a matter of getting rid of the ego, but simply making friends with the limitations of ego, as they say in Zen Buddhism. It's as though there's a role for the ego as an organizing principle, but you don't want to be confined to living only in that particular realm of experience.
Many of the problems that people encounter when they engage in practices like meditation and yoga are well known to experienced meditation teachers and yoga teachers. There are terms in their own traditions to refer to Kundalini crises and people who meditate and start experiencing things that are in some way disconcerting to them. Meditation teachers, in fact, have developed techniques for working with those kinds of experiences. But when these traditions were brought over into the West, much of that kind of experience was not transferred over. And in addition, many people engaged in these practices pretty much on their own. They didn't go to a Zen center or an ashram where they would be under the tutelage of an experienced teacher. They might have gone to a weekend workshop, or they might have even picked it up from an audio or a videotape. As a result, when they started to have these problems, there was nobody who could point them towards a path that would enable them to get their bearings.
One of the factors that enters into psychotherapy is how does your worldview affect your experience, and how do your beliefs create your experience, and how does your experience reinforce your beliefs? And can we question some of those? Can we explore your dreams? Can we find out what else is going on that you're not already fully in touch with? So I think there are many dimensions to transpersonal psychology that are available to a client that would not be available in a strictly rational or medical approach.
My personal work has actually been in this area of helping people to integrate intense transpersonal experiences, because quite often these are very intense experiences, and they can be very disconcerting to an individual. It can throw their equilibrium off. It can even result in a period of time after, say, an intense mystical experience where they're not able to function in everyday reality. And they may need the opportunity to be in a kind of moratorium where people are actually working with them to help them to regain their hold on reality while still retaining the insights that they've gained while in the altered state of consciousness.
In my own work, I like to work with dreams a lot, because dreams often cut through our defenses and bring up things that are really emotionally loaded, that are really intense. And often we can get guidance from our dreams in certain ways if we learn to understand them. So that's really exploring another dimension of consciousness. That's exploring what we call the subtle realms, instead of being locked into one perception, one perspective. Sometimes I think that psychotherapy is about healing the split mind and the broken heart, and that people do get better if they can be in a relationship which allows them to do what they need to do. But I don't know what somebody needs to do when they come in. I have to discover that as they tell me about themselves.
Jim had invited a Sufi teacher from Istanbul, coming out of the Turkish Sufi tradition, and a whole group of his dervishes to come to ITP back in 1980. When I met the teacher, something very powerful happened to me. I had an incredible experience of a sense that he understood me at a level and depth that nobody ever had before. It felt to me in that moment, the moment he glanced at me, as though my whole life was squirted into a huge mainframe computer and integrated, and in a sense integrated such that he knew everything that was going to come out, given that he had all the data up till today. So here's this guy who glanced at me, and I thought, he knows how the rest of my life is going to go.
I didn't even know who he was at the time, and this little voice, I said to myself, and I don't usually talk to myself knowing that's a bad thing as a psychologist. I said, gee, I hope that's the Sufi master that Jim invited, because if that's just one of his students, I don't want to meet this guy's teacher. This is, this is pretty heavy. I was gone from that moment, in a sense. I mean, I really began to develop a relationship with this extraordinary spiritual teacher, which quickly matured to the place where I was willing to trust my spiritual life to him, and in a sense, my life to him. He returned in 1981, and in 1981 I became initiated as a dervish in the Halvedi Jirahi order, which is the Turkish Sufi order that he was the head of. For the past 23 years, that's been my spiritual practice. That's been the core of my life.
It's true with me, as it has been with many other psychologists, that much of our grounding in the work that we do comes from a personal experience. So my personal experience occurred in the early 70s. It was related to taking LSD. It was a period in my life where I spent 2 months in what would be conventionally diagnosed as a psychotic episode, believing that I was a reincarnation of Buddha, I was a reincarnation of Christ, and that I had a mission to write a holy book that was going to be a new Bible for the entire world. Now, just hearing myself say that, I could easily frame that as a psychotic experience, and it certainly meets all the diagnostic criteria for psychosis. But I'm also acutely aware, since it was my experience, that it was a spiritual awakening for me. After the 2 months that I spent in that state, I then set out on a personal spiritual journey to try to figure out what the hell happened here. Why was this Jewish boy all of a sudden involved in thinking he was Buddha and Christ? So it really became a jumping off point for me to explore the world's spiritual traditions. It's what led me into the field of psychology.
On my own street, at that time it was Chicago, at 11:45 before April Fool's Day and my 40th birthday, I got out of my car, and this is right before midnight, and there was a gun to my head. And it was clearly 3 gang kids. I lived in a neighborhood surrounded by ghettos, but it's a university neighborhood. And the guy said, this is a stick-up. And I turned at him and looked at him, and I screamed. And it was very satisfying. I'm satisfied to this day that I let him know I thought this was very unjust. But I did give him my purse then. And he whacked me with the gun and across the cheek, and the gun went off. And so I had no cheek. I was shot in the face. And I didn't know how I'd look, and I didn't know what my life would be after that. So that was a big awakening because this is, of all the brochures I had planned for my life, and all the worries and all the hopes, this one just wasn't in the brochure anywhere. I kept looking back over the brochure. I'd wake up the next day and think, maybe it won't be there. But it was there. And then a few days later, I remembered that I had been working for years, actually, training with a psychic, but she was also a spiritual guide, and we didn't want to be too sensationalistic about things. So on and off, I'd get telepathies, precognitions. Mostly I like to shut them off because they were a little bit catastrophic. But then I remembered 3 days after this shooting that I had had a series of dreams. I'd put them all on tape, and the last one, they led up logically to the last one, which precognized the shooting, which saw in advance that I would get shot. All of the dreams said, you're going to come through this. So it helped. It was nice to know that the mind is awesome. Linear time is not what you think it is. You can see into the future. That counterbalanced. But, so on the one hand, it was helpful in a spiritual awakening. But a lot of work had to be done because it was also the beginning of an illness, very sick PTSD, you know, post-trauma stress, like a veteran. And that went on for 7 years. But to cure myself, I got to do wonderful things, go off to see all the countries I wanted to see. I went to India, I went to China, Tibet. I did that on a shoestring, but I did it long, like for a year, to heal. And that was definitely the initiation, the real breaking apart of a little success script, you know, an American success script, climb the academic ladder or be a super therapist. Or, the breaking apart of all my assumptions. I just needed the proof. I needed proof. I'd been flirting with it for a couple of decades.
By that time, my daughter had died, which brings tears to think about, too. We had a wonderful time with her before she died. She was really great. I will tell you a story about her, which has to do with Zen. She was reading about what all the religions had to say about after death, which is something that as a teacher I've had lots of people who've come to me, they're concerned about what's going to happen to them after they die. It's not something you think of when you're 40 or, but you do think of it when you're sitting zazen, which has a lot to do with dying and letting go, put it that way, which is what dying is. And she read, she said, "Oh, Mother, everything is so culturally determined." She said, if you're afraid of reincarnation, or if you're afraid of hell, purgatory, or how to get into heaven after you die, or if you're an American Indian, you've got happy hunting grounds. Or if you're an Islamist or a Muslim, she said, the guys do pretty well in heaven. I haven't been able to read anything which says that the women do very well in heaven. But she said, it's all so culturally conditioned, I just can't go there. She said, I can understand if it were a different age and you were brought up entirely within one religion or another, you wouldn't even know there were other stories. But I can't go there. She said, I just can't. And so I was sitting with her every day for that last 2 years at least when she was on her bed, my funny daughter. And finally, I read to her the Zen concept of don't know mind. There is a Zen concept, don't know mind. And she said, that's me. That's me. I can do that. I can don't know. That's the truth for me, she said. Call Coben. I want to be ordained. So Coben came over and he ordained her on the sofa over there and called her. Her Dharma name was Ocean of Truth. And she was a terrific teacher, as dying people often will be. The teaching stick was in her hand, not in mine. And it was a wonderful experience to be with her. Yeah. Next question.
I guess the most amazing thing to me is the persistence of the interest in what we call transpersonal experience and phenomena. That it arises in so many places, at so many times, so many cultures. and that it can get formed in so many ways, some of which are in total conflict with each other. And then the amazing thing is that all these forms are just so many marks on the window, that what's coming through the window and what you can see through the window is what it's about. But the design I draw on the window, whether I make an icon out of that design or whether I completely paint the window black because I don't want to see what's on the other side, or whether I scratch a design in it and make it my own little unique, peculiar design, or whether I turn it into an altar, or whatever it is, that form is the part that changes all the time. What doesn't change all the time is what's on the other side of the window and what's coming through the window. So that there could be some universal, that there is a universal aspect to whatever is transpersonal is partly amazing, but what's the most amazing is there can be all these forms. And with so many different forms, some of which are lethal and brutal and terrible human conflict laden, that still to know that, well, if we don't get it right, maybe another generation will, or if these individuals have wrecked something, maybe somebody else can repair it. But that's all work on the forms. What's behind the forms, what's through that, that's the amazing part, that it persists, that it's there. So that, other than people, Tony Sudich is probably the most amazing person I've ever met. Just totally contradicts reality in terms of what's possible. And what a great pleasure and reward to know of somebody like that and work with them. He's the amazing guy that I have known. And a lot of amazing people in the field, I must say. It's great to have worked in a field where people are basically great people, good motives, bright, intelligent. So a lot of amazing in this business, this activity, this profession I've been in. So my great game.